When people think of ancient Egypt, the first things that usually come to mind are pyramids, pharaohs, and golden treasures hidden in tombs. But there is a side to Egyptian civilization that rarely gets talked about, one that is far more intimate, shocking, and fascinating. Behind the hieroglyphs and the stone temples, Egyptian sexuality wasn't like anything we could imagine today. It wasn't just about private desires or secret encounters. To the Egyptians, sex was sacred. It was tied directly to their religion, their politics, and even the survival of their civilization. What might seem strange, even scandalous to us today, was seen as completely natural and divine to them. They didn't shy away from sexuality. They celebrated it as a force of creation, a bridge between the human and the divine. Their myths, rituals, and festivals all reflected this belief, turning acts that would make modern audiences blush into cosmic events that shaped the destiny of an empire. At the heart of their worldview was a creation story unlike any other. According to ancient pyramid texts, the universe itself began with an act of divine self-pleasure. The god Adam, sometimes called the self-created one, emerged out of the dark, chaotic waters of none. Alone in the void, Adam brought the world into being by pleasuring himself. From his seed came Shu and Tefnut, the first divine pair, who in turn gave rise to the rest of the gods and eventually humanity itself. To the Egyptians, this wasn't obscene, it was the ultimate creative act, the spark of life that separated nothingness from existence. Even today, if you visit temples such as Karnak, you'll find carvings of Adam with his hand on his phallus, a direct representation of the universe being born through divine ejaculation. This wasn't hidden away or censored. It was carved into stone for generations to see, reminding them that sexual power was at the core of cosmic order. And this myth wasn't just a story told by priests, it was reenacted by the pharaohs themselves. Once every year, during the flooding of the Nile, a natural event that determined whether Egypt would starve or flourish, the king performed a ritual that would shock most of us today. Standing at the edge of the river, the pharaoh publicly masturbated, spilling his semen into the Nile. Just as Adam had created the universe, the pharaoh's act was believed to renew the fertility of the land and guarantee the survival of the people. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the Nile's flood was too small, famine followed. If it was too large, villages were washed away. The balance was delicate, and the Egyptians believed their king's sexual potency could tip the scales. Imagine the pressure, an entire civilization watching, believing that your performance could determine whether their crops grew or failed. This wasn't just politics, it was cosmic responsibility. No wonder pharaohs were seen as living gods. Their ability to command creation itself through sexuality set them apart from ordinary men. Archaeologists have found traces of these rituals in inscriptions and temple chambers. Certain sanctuaries were reserved for the king's preparation, with hieroglyphic texts carefully recording the prayers he would recite during the act. The Egyptians even had a specific word for this ceremony, shade, which appears again and again in royal texts, always tied to abundance and fertility. For them, it wasn't embarrassing, it was life itself, ritualized. But sexuality in ancient Egypt didn't end with life. Death, in their belief system, was only the beginning of another chapter, and that chapter included pleasure. The Egyptians saw the afterlife not as a cold, shadowy realm, but as a continuation of life at its best: youth, health, endless food, and yes, sex. Tomb paintings and papyrus texts describe the field of reeds, a paradise where the dead could feast, drink, and make love for eternity. Sexuality was so central to their vision of existence that they believed even in death, it must be preserved. This belief stemmed from one of their most important myths, the story of Osiris. Betrayed and murdered by his jealous brother Seth, Osiris's body was hacked into 14 pieces and scattered across Egypt. His devoted wife, Isis, searched for the pieces and reassembled her husband's body, but one vital piece was missing: his penis. Refusing to give up, Isis crafted a magical replacement, restored Osiris's manhood, and conceived their son Horus. Through this act, she not only ensured the continuation of the divine bloodline but also established the model for Egyptian resurrection itself. This is why so many funerary rituals carried sexual undertones. The opening of the mouth ceremony, where priests touched the lips, eyes, and other parts of the mummy with sacred tools, symbolized restoring the senses, and that included sexual function. Words associated with this ritual were linked to potency and virility. Egyptian tomb art often depicts the deceased enjoying sexual activities in the afterlife. And even erotic papyri like the famous Turin papyrus show scenes of pleasure that were expected to continue on the grave. The Egyptians took this belief so seriously that they preserved sexual organs during mummification. Male mummies were sometimes fitted with artificial phalluses, while female mummies were given resin-molded vulvas. Modern CT scans of royal mummies confirm this surprising detail. The Egyptians believed no one could journey into eternity without their sexual identity intact. For them, a sexless afterlife simply wasn't worth having. When pharaohs like Tutankhamun were buried, their tombs included items not just for survival, but for pleasure, ensuring that the afterlife mirrored the joys of the living world. To the Egyptians, sex wasn't dirty or taboo. It was sacred, eternal, and inseparable from the divine cycle of creation, death, and rebirth. If you think modern music festivals or carnivals get a little wild, they're nothing compared to what happened in ancient Egypt. For the Egyptians, sexuality wasn't something hidden behind closed doors. It was paraded through the streets in full view of everyone. And the most extreme example of this was the annual festival of Nin. Nin was one of Egypt's oldest gods, worshipped as the embodiment of male potency and fertility. In temple carvings, he's almost always shown the same way, standing tall, holding a flail in one hand, and his enormous erect phallus in the other. To modern eyes, these images look shocking, but to the Egyptians, they symbolized life-giving power, the force that kept crops growing and ensured women could bear children. Every year, during Nin's festival, his statue was carried out of the temple and paraded through the streets. But this wasn't some small sacred icon. We're talking about a full-size divine image, complete with an exaggerated phallus so massive it required its own team of bearers. Imagine living in Thebes and seeing this giant statue roll down your street, cheered on by priests, musicians, and chanting crowds. To us, it might seem surreal, but to them, it was a sacred moment of connection with the divine. The ritual didn't end with the procession. Women lined the streets, and as Nin's statue passed, many exposed themselves in front of it. This act wasn't shameful. It was believed to invite the god's blessing and increase fertility. And married women, in particular, took part, hoping to absorb Nin's procreative energy and attract both divine favor and earthly husbands. What looked scandalous from the outside was, to them, a prayer in action. And then came the lettuce. Yes, lettuce. The Egyptians believed certain tall varieties resembled an erect phallus. When snapped, they released a milky white sap, which they associated with semen. During the festival, priests presented towering heads of lettuce to Nin as sacred offerings. Temple inscriptions even show these offerings being made while fertility prayers were recited. It may sound humorous now, but to the Egyptians, the symbolism was powerful. The festival culminated in an even more dramatic scene, for wild bulls were released into the fields, symbolizing Nin's virility spreading across the land. At the same time, the pharaoh himself would step forward, cutting the sheath of grain, a symbolic act that tied his own sexual potency to the fertility of Egypt's agriculture. Foreign visitors, like the Greek historian Herodotus, were astonished by the openness of these rituals. To outsiders, Egypt looked shockingly explicit, but within Egypt, these ceremonies weren't seen as obscene. They were religious celebrations of the creative energy that kept the entire civilization alive. Yet, for all their enthusiasm about fertility, the Egyptians were just as creative when it came to preventing it. They lived in a world where children meant both survival and responsibility. Too many mouths to feed could be dangerous in a desert society. That's why some of the earliest contraceptive methods in human history come from Egypt, and they were as bizarre as they were clever. The most infamous example comes from the Kahun and Eber's medical papyri, which describe a contraceptive mixture made of crocodile dung, honey, and sodium carbonate. This mixture was inserted vaginally as a pessary. At first glance, it sounds like a nightmare, but modern science has shown that crocodile dung is highly alkaline. which could actually make the environment hostile to sperm. Combined with the sticky honey and the physical barrier it created, this strange concoction might have been more effective than we'd like to admit. Of course, the hygiene risks would have been horrifying by modern standards. Another method involved acacia gum, mixed with honey and dates, applied to a piece of lint, and inserted vaginally. Modern research has confirmed that acacia releases lactic acid, an ingredient still used in some spermicides today. In other words, Egyptians may have invented the world's first chemical contraceptive. This was more than superstition, it was practical, science-driven medicine thousands of years ahead of its time. They also experimented with plant-based remedies. Medical texts suggest that women drank mixtures of pomegranate seeds and beer for several days as a way to disrupt fertility. Modern analysis has shown that pomegranate contains natural estrogen, which could interfere with conception. It wasn't a birth control pill, but it was shockingly close. And contraception wasn't their only concern. They also had recipes for unblocking menstruation, a phrase that was often a euphemism for abortion. The Ebers Papyrus records formulas using dates, onions, celery, and even heated mixtures of honey and oil applied to the abdomen. Some of these plants are known today to have abortive properties. Combined with Egypt's magical traditions, amulets shaped like the dwarf god bees, or spells written to bind the womb, these methods show a civilization deeply invested in controlling reproduction. What's striking isn't just the methods themselves, but the matter-of-fact way they were treated. These weren't dirty secrets whispered about in shame. They were written down in medical manuals, taught to physicians, and preserved in libraries. For the Egyptians, sex and reproduction were central to survival. It made sense to manage them practically, with the same seriousness they applied to farming or medicine. In this way, Egyptian sexuality was full of contradictions. It was celebrated in wild public festivals, immortalized in myths about divine creation, and yet also carefully regulated through medical knowledge and ritual practices. They embraced sex as sacred, but they also knew it had to be controlled. This balance between indulgence and discipline helped sustain one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. When it comes to Egyptian sexuality, some practices went beyond fertility rituals or divine myths. To modern audiences, these traditions can seem deeply unsettling, but for the Egyptians, they weren't shocking at all. They were seen as logical extensions of their worldview. Rooted in religion, politics, and survival, among the most controversial customs was royal incest. Long before Game of Thrones shocked viewers with sibling marriages, Egyptian pharaohs were living it. In fact, royal incest wasn't rare, it was the norm. Kings often married their sisters, and sometimes even their daughters. Far from being a scandal, these marriages were celebrated in official art and inscriptions. To the Egyptians, there was nothing shameful about it. Instead, it was a way of imitating the gods. The divine precedent came from mythology. Osiris married his sister Isis. Their son, Horus, married Hathor, who in some traditions was described as his mother. These godly unions provided a model for human kings. By marrying their sisters, pharaohs claimed to be following divine law. This allowed them to maintain not only power, but also a sacred bloodline. To outsiders, it looked twisted. To Egyptians, it looked holy. One of the most infamous examples was Cleopatra VII. The Cleopatra, before her famous affairs with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, she married not one but two of her brothers in succession. Her parents were also likely siblings, and she wasn't an exception. DNA analysis of Tutankhamun's mummy has revealed that his parents were brother and sister. His father, Akhenaten, reportedly married some of his own daughters after the death of Nefertiti. This cycle repeated for centuries. The Ptolemies, Egypt's last royal dynasty, perfected the practice. Their family tree wasn't a tree at all, it was a loop. The political reasoning behind these marriages was simple: keep power in the family. A sister wife was far less likely to betray her husband, since her interests were tied to the dynasty's survival. More importantly, it kept outsiders from gaining a claim to the throne. The pharaoh's family was both the ruling house and a divine bloodline. Sharing that with another family would dilute the power. Incest, then, wasn't about passion, it was about politics and religion. Of course, the consequences were severe. Tutankhamun's body shows evidence of multiple genetic disorders: a clubfoot, a cleft palate, and fragile bones. CT scans of other royal mummies reveal similar congenital problems. The Ptolemies, especially in their final generations, were described by contemporaries as sickly and unstable. But rather than seeing these deformities as curses, Egyptians often interpreted them as proof of divinity, if the gods themselves were different from mortals. Then the pharaoh's physical oddities became signs of his sacred heritage, on official coins. The Ptolemaic rulers were often depicted with bulging eyes and elongated skulls, not as accidents, but as deliberate symbols of their uniqueness. Royal incest persisted for more than 3,000 years, making it one of history's longest-running social experiments. It finally ended only when Rome conquered Egypt, imposing their own taboos. Cleopatra VII, fittingly, was the last pharaoh to marry her sibling, marking both the end of a dynasty and the end of a tradition. But incest wasn't the only unsettling aspect of Egyptian sexuality. One of the darkest claims comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt around 450 BC. He wrote that when beautiful women died, their bodies were not immediately given to embalmers. Instead, they were kept aside for 3 days. Why? Because there had been cases of embalmers committing necrophilia with fresh corpses. To this day, historians debate whether Herodotus was exaggerating. Was this a smear by a foreign observer? Or was it a rare but real problem? The evidence is murky, but there are clues. Egyptian religious texts include something called the negative confession, where the deceased recites sins they claim not to have committed. Among the standard lines like "I have not killed" or "I have not stolen," there is also "I have not had sexual relations with a corpse." The fact that this needed to be said at all suggests Egyptians recognized necrophilia as a real taboo. The embalming process itself may have made the risk plausible. Embalmers were priests of Anubis, working in sacred workshops known as pernefer. Their job was to purify and preserve the body so the soul could live forever. Any sexual violation would have been both sacrilegious and criminal. Still, Herodotus's claim of a 3-day waiting period to protect corpses may contain a grain of truth. By delaying embalming, families may have been ensuring their loved ones weren't desecrated. Whether literal or exaggerated, this story reveals an important fact. The Egyptians acknowledged even the darkest corners of human sexuality. They didn't pretend impulses didn't exist. Instead, they built safeguards, rituals, laws, taboos to protect the integrity of the body and soul. For them, preserving the dead was as sacred as celebrating life. Taken together, these stories of incestuous dynasties, fertility festivals, contraceptive experiments, and even taboo violations paint a picture of a civilization where sexuality wasn't hidden or denied. It was embraced as a force that shaped gods, kings, and commoners alike. To modernize, much of it seems bizarre, even shocking, but to the Egyptians, sexuality was survival. In a harsh desert world where the fertility of the land meant life or death, sex was divine. It was the key to cosmic order, the heartbeat of religion, and the secret thread that bound their civilization for more than 3,000 years. If you enjoyed diving into this piece of history, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss more fascinating stories from the past.